Hello, and welcome back to Door County Coastal Terrestrial Invasive Species Education. This has been made possible by funding through the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program and NOAA. In this video, we're going to be covering plant identification, specifically focusing on woody invasive species. While there are multiple species out there, we're going to be focusing on these 6 here, both common and glossy buckthorn, honeysuckle, barberry, autumn olive, burning bush, and princess tree. So we'll start off with common buckthorn. Common buckthorn is native to Eurasia and was introduced here in North America in the 1880s. It was introduced as a common ornamental plant and typically planted as a hedgerow. This species typically invades woodlands, but can also be found in prairies, savannas, pastures, old fields, and roadsides. It does like a little bit more of a shaded area, so if you find it in these more open habitats, it's usually going to be found around existing trees or shrubs where the young juveniles have a chance to survive and grow up before they become more competitive. In comparison to glossy buckthorn, which we will be talking about in just a few minutes, this one likes slightly drier sites. So with common buckthorn, their leaves are oval shaped with 3 to 5 prominent pairs of curved veins, as you can see in these pictures here. The edges of the leaves have really fine teeth or little serrations along the edges, and their leaves are interesting. They're what we consider sub-opposites, so they're not quite opposite, but they're not always alternates. They sort of vary, so not always a great giveaway unless you have those sub-opposite ones, as you can see in that far right picture here. And in that far right picture, you'll notice it does have a little thorn at the tips. These twigs often have that thorn, where it gets its common name from, buckthorn. So the branches and trunks of buckthorn are dotted with these light colored little markings, which are called lenticels. It's sort of how oxygen is transferred between the tree and the outside. As the trunks and trees get older, they start to become a little bit more peely, kind of like paper curling up. And the key signature of buckthorn is that orange inner bark. So if you were to shave off the outside of that just a little bit, you would see that bright orange inner bark area. And it produces a ton of dark black berries. Glossy buckthorn also was native to Eurasia and was introduced sometime in the 1800s, and like common buckthorn was commonly planted as a hedgerow and actually used as a wildlife and food cover until it was really determined that it had a very invasive tendencies and does not provide much nutritional value for birds and other wildlife. And this one does best on sunny, moist sites. So these leaves are a little bit different. They're very similar shaped, so they have that oval shaped, but they have 6 to 9 pairs of veins, and these veins, as you can see in this top right picture, are almost at 45-degree angles to the center of the leaf, so they're not curved up. The edges also are what we call smooth, so there are no teeth along those edges of the leaf, and they're mostly alternate from each other. They can sometimes be close together, but more often than not, they're going to be very distinctively alternate. And one good ID trick for wintertime is if you look at the buds, the tips of the branches, they're covered in these really fine, minute brown fuzz-like hairs. Kind of attractive in my opinion, but a great identification factor for when you're unsure of something in the wintertime. So like common buckthorn, these will have lenticels along the bark. The bark starts off more of a deep brown when it's younger, then it starts to mature into this gray color, but as you can see, it's spotted with all of those little white lenticels. And the fruits on this tree vary in color actually. So they start off green when they're immature, and they sort of mature go through red and eventually turn into a dark brown or a dark purple color. But on a single tree, as you see in this bottom left picture there, one branch or one individual can have fruit of different maturity levels. So you're going to see that color grading along one stem. So I talked about the leaves a little bit for each species, but I want to do a side-by-side comparison of both common buckthorn and glossy buckthorn, because when it has its leaves out, this is the easiest distinguishing factor. So as you can see, the common buckthorn, those leaves curve up almost like make a U shape, where glossy buckthorn has straight veins, and then the leaf edges as well. Common buckthorn will have those teeth along the edges, where glossy buckthorn will not. So there are going to be some lookalikes that might confuse people, and it's always good to know what you're dealing with. So for common buckthorn, the most common species that may be encountered is going to be our cherry species, so your prunus. They have variable bark color as well, and the younger bark for our cherry trees does have these noticeable lenticels, but the inside of the bark would not have that bright orange coloring to it. These leaves are going to be very distinctively alternate from each other, unlike the common buckthorn, which are a little going to be closer together, or that sub-opposites. And these teeth are a little bit finer, I find, and more sharply pointed. And then the leaf tips, the very end of it, comes up into more of a abrupt point of the tip, not so rounded. And then the fruits of the cherry trees are going to be bright red to a deep purple sometimes, but they're going to be in drooping clusters, not scattered along the stems like the buckthorn will have. And they will occupy very similar habitats to one another. On the other hand, for our glossy buckthorn, the most common species that you might encounter that looks similar is going to be your adlers. So they'll have those lenticels as well on the bark, but there are two, if you have leaves on them, these leaves are have edges, but they're kind of like doubly serrated, so they're a little bit more jagged than like common buckthorn would be. And they don't have a fleshy fruit. They have more of a dry, almost pine cone, miniature pine cone shaped fruit on it. And these little catkins up in the top right picture there, those will persist through the winter time. So if you see that in the winter, you know you're not dealing with buckthorn. So we're going to move on to honeysuckle now. Again, this was also native to Eurasia and introduced sometime in the 1800s. And it was introduced for a variety of reasons: ornamental, erosion control, wildlife cover, all of those things. It did really, really well and became more of a problem for our natural areas. So we're going to be doing a broad generalization of honeysuckle. There are multiple species that grow within Door County, and they have been known to hybridize, so it can be really tricky to get a very specific species, but all of the honeysuckles that are non-native are invasive and they're all problematic. So we're just going to broadly cover them to give you an idea of what to be looking for. So with our honeysuckles, the leaves are always going to be opposites. They're oblong shapes, so they're kind of like a long oval, and they have rounded tips. Now the tip shape can vary a little bit between them, but they're always going to be they're not going to be a jagged tip too often. Flower color will vary between the different species, but one thing they do have in common, all the honeysuckles have in common, is they're paired in the leaf axils. So where those opposite leaves meet, there will always be a pair of flowers as well. And they can be white, pink, so don't be too fixated on that. And then they will develop into little clusters of berries, 2 to 3 at each area, usually red or orange. So honeysuckle will have multiple arching branches coming from one central area in the ground. And then as shrubs mature, it becomes a more dark gray and really peely, like peeling off in long strips of bark. And one identifying feature for honeysuckle is they have a hollow center, or what's known as a pith. So if you cut off a branch of honeysuckle and look inside, it will be like a straw which you could suck up something. And the pith is important, especially for winter ID for trees and shrubs, because various trees and shrubs will have different styles of piths. Just a little fun fact to have. In the bottom left there, I showed a picture of various types of piths that exist out there. But honeysuckles will always be hollow in the center. There are a couple of lookalikes that will be encountered. Elderberry will have a very similar growth form with lots of arching stems, and they'll have opposite branching, so the leaves will always be opposite from one another. But these leaves are going to be compound, so very similar to your ash trees or your black walnuts. There will be multiple little leaflets per each leaf. And then these produce big white clusters, flat top clusters of fruits or flowers, and then they turn into these deep dark purple berries. And then the pith on elderberry will always be solid. So if you were to cut off a stem and look inside, it would be completely solid there. Ninebark will have a similar growth form of arching stems and also has a very shreddy bark as it matures. But the leaves will be alternating on this one, and they will have toothed edges, unlike the honeysuckle. And these ones have little clusters of white flowers, and then actually as they mature, they turn into these dry, papery seed capsules that will persist through the winter. So to keep going with the honeysuckles, there are actually native honeysuckles in Wisconsin. Most of them are like a shrubby or viney growth form. They're not going to be as robust as our non-native invasive honeysuckles. They will also have a solid stem like our elderberries. So if you were to cut open a stem, you would notice that there's no hole in the center. They don't typically get as large either, and they often don't coexist with one another. It's not saying they can't, but a lot of times these are going to be restricted to more of our high quality areas or more restricted areas. And do want to mention the honeysuckle that's not really a honeysuckle, Diervilla lanicera. It looks like a honeysuckle because it has that opposite leaves, paired fruits there, but it's a completely different species. It's a great alternative to honeysuckle and something that I would strongly consider using if you're doing any sort of removal. So now we're going to talk about barberry. It is native to Japan, and again was introduced somewhere in the 1800s as an ornamental plant, and unfortunately is still widely used today due to its resistance to deer browsing. There are multiple horticultural varieties out there to get different colors of leaves and growth forms and all sorts of stuff, so you'll still see it quite regularly used. So these leaves are kind of interesting. They look almost like a spatula, and they're clustered in little groups along the stem, and these clusters alternate up the stem. So it may not look really apparent when you're closely examining or looking at it from a distance, but if you get into it, you would see each cluster alternates up the stem. And then the flowers actually dangle below the stem, so they might not be as obvious when they're flowering, but in the wintertime, those red berries will persist, so they're very, very noticeable then. And these stems also have that arching form, so you'll have lots of stems from one plant coming out of one general area. This is something I did not know until this. Each of these stems are actually really deeply grooved, so if you're unsure, you can look at that. That's a pretty unique characteristics. And there's also going to be a single spine at each of those leaf clusters. So it's not something you just want to be grabbing into because they are sharp and they are very slender, so they will poke through most gloves. And the inner bark of this one is bright yellow, almost like a highlighter yellow. So if you were to cut it off, you would see that bright yellow inside. So there is another barberry in Wisconsin. It's relatively uncommon. It's common barberry. Looks superficially similar. A few key differences are the leaf edges of common barberry are going to have teeth along the edges. Our the other barberry, Japanese barberry, does not have teeth along the edges. And then the flowers are actually more elongated clusters, and they're going to be more yellow in color, but they droop down a lot more. And then the fruits as well there. And if you're seeing this in wintertime, the spines are not single stem, they're actually three pronged, so they look a little bit more vicious than your normal common barberry. There are a couple of things that might be confused with barberry. The most common one would be our native gooseberries or ribes species. This would probably most be commonly confused during wintertime, since gooseberries also have spine along their stems. But if you're seeing it in the growing season when there are leaves on there, these leaves are fan-shaped, almost palmate in style, where it looks almost like a hand. And they're just overall larger. And then the flowers are going to be more of a tubular shape, still drooping down and whitish or yellowish in color. And fruits will be variable across the different species of ribes, but they're always going to be typically a dark purple to black color, not so much that vibrant small red color as the Japanese barberry has. Autumn olive, actually changing up where it's native to, is native to Asia and was introduced sometime in the 1830s for food and cover for wildlife. It's also used as reclamation for disturbed or wasteland areas. This is because autumn olive can fix nitrogen into poor soils, so it can actually change the soil chemistry. It's one of those cases where it did its thing so well, it's just been prolific, and when a species like this can get into a native habitat that's relatively undisturbed, it can actually change the soil chemistry. So it may not immediately cause a problem, but over time, as it changes the chemistry, it's going to physically force out other native species that cannot handle a high nitrogen area. So autumn olive will have alternate leaves. They're a long, elongated football is kind of how I think about them, with a fine point at each end, so it kind of tapers into a tip. The leaf edges are wavy, but they do not have any teeth along there. And they are really distinctive in the growing season. They're dark green on top, and then the undersides of the leaves are very silvery. So the autumn olive has very fragrant flowers. If you see this in the flowering season when it has its flowers, you're going to probably smell it before you actually see it. And you'll be looking around wondering what smells so good. Kind of like lilac bushes have that very fragrant smell to them. So they're in clusters of cream or yellow colored flowers, and then these develop into red speckled fruits. So the branches of autumn olive are really characteristic as well. So this is helpful in wintertime. They have this silvery brownish scale on the new growth. So the very tips of the branches will have this, and it stands out really well. They do sometimes have thorns. They're pretty robust, up to an inch long, but they're not always going to be present. And a lot of times you'll find that autumn olive can be multiple stems. So you might have one central sizable trunk and then a lot of smaller stems coming out from that same area. There is Russian olive, which is very closely related to autumn olive, that does grow here in Door County. It's not something that I've encountered before. It is also invasive, so something to be on the watch for. It is going to be taller and more tree-like than autumn olive is. Always subjective there, but the leaves are going to be the very big difference. So Russian olive will have very slender, long leaves that are silvery on both sides of the leaf, so they're almost whitish in color. And the flowers are going to be a very distinctive yellow color, and the fruits actually are silvery to yellowish, not that vibrant red color that autumn olive will have. And there is actually a native species, buffalo berry, that is closely related to olive. They're in the same family, so they're kind of like cousins to one another. the key difference between the two is the leaf attachment. So buffalo berry will have opposite leaves, where the olives will always have alternate leaves. So if you're ever unsure, just look how the leaves are attached, or the buds as you see in this far right picture. Those are the new emerging leaf buds. This will have those dark green leaves, and then on the underside are actually like rusty looking scales, which are actually minute hairs. If you look under a magnifying glass, you could see them there, but they kind of have a rusty scale appearance to them. Burning bush, native to Northeast Asia, and it was introduced primarily as an ornamental shrub. It is really valued for its vibrant red foliage. That's where it gets its common name from. And this is really an adaptive plant, so it can grow in all varieties of habitats. So it's not going to just be limited to one specific, like dry upland, forest upland. So this is more of an up and coming species, I sort of say, for Door County. At least it's still used in the landscape and it's still available, but I'm starting to see a little more here and there in our natural areas. So burning bush will have opposite leaves that are football shaped. It has really finely toothed edges of the leaves, and they're going to be like a darker green color, which, like I said earlier, turn bright red in autumn. But the most characteristic thing about this shrub is the stems themselves. They're greenish in color, but they have these prominent raised corky wings. So if you look at the tips of the branches, you'll see them. It's like flat edges along there. And those do over time sort of mellow out, but the ends of the branches will always have those. And they don't really have prominent flowers, but they do have prominent fruits, which will turn into like a mature red berry with a orange berry with a red casing, so to speak. And there are a couple of lookalikes. Both of these species are in the same genus, so the Euonymus. So we have our eastern wahoo, which is relatively uncommon here in Door County, but it's still something you might encounter. Its branches are weakly four-sided, so you may sometimes see them as a square, sometimes maybe not. They'll have slight, and this kind of comes from the corky edges that are along the angle. So where burning bush has really prominent ones, this one will just sort of be very minute, so almost like raised edges versus actually making wings. And the leaves are going to be larger than burning bush, and they actually will turn a yellowish color in fall. So there is also another non-native Euonymus here in Door County, European spindle tree. The big difference you're going to find is it does not have those winged stems, but the fruits are pinkish or reddish, and the insides are an orange fleshy seed. Otherwise, it's going to look quite similar to your burning bush. So princess tree, I had this one kind of last minute because it's a relatively new species for Wisconsin in general, and I was just made aware of there is an occurrence of princess tree in Door County. So it's native to Eastern Asia, and as you can see by this picture, it was introduced as an ornamental tree. It has beautiful purplish flowers, and this one does thrive in full sun, but it can adapt into areas of shade as well. So these leaves are very large. We're talking 6 to 15 inches long and just about as wide. They're going to have an opposite attachment, and the undersides of the leaves are actually going to be quite fuzzy, as you can see in this bottom picture there. As I mentioned earlier, they have like these purplish lavender flowers, very large and very tubular in shape, almost like dangling like a bell. And then these will turn into brown dried capsules, more like beads, which is a key feature for identifying it from other species. So it may be confused with our northern catapult tree, which is here in Door County. It also has really large leaves. The catapult trees are going to be more of a heart-shaped on them, but they have very similar flowers. Catapult will have white flowers with the purple spots inside of it, but they're also tubular in shape. But the seed pods are really going to be what's the differing factor. Catapult tree will have seed pods that are long and slender, almost like a green bean, versus little bead-like capsules. And that is the end of our woody invasives.